Wow, you know, it's been now several months since the election, and I have to admit that for me, the shock and elation and even relief of November 8th has not fully subsided. And quite honestly, I don't think the shock and dismay and horror of that moment has subsided for the other side either. Somewhat reminded of the opening scene in Paradise Lost, when after mounting an abortive campaign against God, Lucifer and the rebel angels are, in Milton's words, flung headlong flaming from the ethereal sky down to bottomless perdition. And as they land in hell, they all at first are completely dazed, but after a while they begin to bump into each other and conspire and plot. And this, I think, is a kind of pretty good image of the Democratic Party right now. You know, I think as I look across the landscape today, it's almost as if this was a straight fight between Republicans and Democrats, Republicans would win hands down. But the Democrats have actually unleashed their other flank, and that is the combined force of academia, Hollywood, and the media. Three huge megaphones of our culture. And as I think back again to before the election, I mean, just the unbelievable efforts of so many actors and actresses and reporters trying to drag crooked Hillary across the finish line, and now they're after Trump. Well, I want to talk today about some themes that are in my new book, The Big Lie, which is subtitled Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. The Nazi roots of the American left. The reason I picked this topic to look into at all is because in the past, for almost a generation, the strongest card played by the left against us was the race card. Republicans are racist. You're the party of bigotry. And in the last book, Hillary's America and Movie, we took on the race card. We tried to show, basically, that this was a fraud, that the Democratic Party has been the party of slavery, of segregation, of Jim Crow, of racial terrorism, of the Ku Klux Klan, of opposition to the civil rights movement of the 60s. They did it. And in unbelievable sleight of hand, they now are trying to blame us for what they did. It's almost like a bunch of guys who poison the wells and then pretend to show up as the water commissioner. So that was the theme of Hillary's America. But if you're watching things now very carefully, you realize that the left has shifted gears. They've gone from playing the race card to a new card, the fascism card. And the fascism card is not an abandonment of the race card, because the fascists, and particularly the Nazis, were racists. They were anti-Semites. They tried to create a regime based on racial supremacy. And so the race card is now back, but it's inside the umbrella of the fascist card. And the point of the fascist card isn't mere rhetoric. It's not words being used carelessly. The left is doing this because they want to legitimize all kinds of extremist, barbaric behavior that would not otherwise be condoned. These Antifa guys on the campus look, talk, and act like fascists. They carry weapons, they're costumed, they wear masks, they use intimidation, if not violence. They seem to resemble quite closely Mussolini's black shirts or Hitler's brown shirts. But the main difference is that they claim to be anti-fascists. So they are drawing on the moral prestige of anti-fascism, and they are trying to stain us with the fascism that has now the ineradicable legacy of Holocaust. I want to take a moment to examine the argument, because it's made with genuine, when it was made against Reagan, Reagan's a fascist, Bush is a fascist, it was a throwaway term. With Trump, they mean it. And the arguments, there are arguments made to defend it. Trump is a fascist because Trump is an ultra-nationalist, the left tells us. Trump wants to make America great again. Didn't Hitler want to make Germany great again? Now, we've got to be a little careful about this kind of stuff, and the reason I like to do these books and take the trouble to look into them is because what we're seeing here is a very deep sleight of hand, a sleight of hand that actually goes back 50 to 75 years. The truth of it is nationalism is not a defining feature of fascism. That's a lie. And it can easily be shown to be a lie by simply looking at people around the world who were or are nationalists. So for example, I'm originally from India. Gandhi was a nationalist. Mandela was a nationalist in South Africa. The American founders were nationalists. Winston Churchill was a nationalist. So was de Gaulle in France. All the anti-colonial leaders were nationalists. Now, obviously, all these men were not fascists. So if simply a ultra-nationalism were to define fascism, then they would be. So the notion that fascism is nationalism is clearly erroneous. Fascism is actually something else. But what that something else is a little hard to say. Why? Because the left has stripped fascism of its actual ideological content. The way to be clear about this is to ask yourself a simple question. We all know whenever you have a powerful ideological movement, it typically has a philosopher who articulates its central beliefs. And so, for example, who's the philosopher of Marxism? Well, Marx. Who's the philosopher of capitalism? Well, Adam Smith. But if I were to ask you, who's the philosopher of fascism, it's a little hard-pressed to say. No one really knows. Why? Not because he doesn't exist. He actually does exist. His name is Giovanni Gentile. He was Mussolini's Minister of Education, a world-famous philosopher of his time in the early 20th century, but someone who has been airbrushed from history. Why? Because if you actually were to read his work, you'd begin to see that fascism is something completely different from what the progressives painted out to be. The question I want to explore today is whether fascism is actually on the left or on the right. It is almost taken for granted that fascism is on the right. And I'm suggesting that this notion is a fiction invented by the progressives after World War II. Before World War II, everybody knew that fascism was on the left. The fascists knew it, and the anti-fascists knew it. But after the war, fascism became redefined and moved into the right-wing column. And what gave plausibility to this new, you may say, fictional definition of fascism was that if you looked at World War II, the communists fought on one side, and the fascists were on the other. So it seemed to make sense that if communism is left-wing, fascism must be right-wing. Because after all, they just fought a big war against each other. But we also know that there are all kinds of wars that are fought among ideologies that are extremely close to each other. The Catholics and the Protestants fought bitter battles, even though their differences were on fine points of theology. The Shia and the Sunni have been at it for centuries, even though they're both inside the house of Islam. Here's the point. The three great collectivist movements of the 20th century were communism, fascism, and progressivism. All three are on the same side of the spectrum, on the same side of the aisle, the left. Mussolini was a Marxist. He was the most famous Marxist in Italy, along with another guy named Gramsci. When Mussolini started the fascist party, he was, by the way, the leader of fascism. Mussolini started the first fascist regime in the world with his march on Rome in 1922. He got a telegram from Lenin. Why? Because Lenin recognized Mussolini as a fellow revolutionary on the left. Hitler, most of you know, was a National Socialist. When Hitler became head of the German Workers' Party, he changed the name. National Socialist German Workers' Party. Why? He wanted to emphasize, to italicize the socialism that was at the heart of Nazism. So the left, after the war, has had to sort of take out the socialism from National Socialism, to redefine fascism, if you will. In this book, I try to look at what does fascism at its core actually mean. And what fascism actually means is it's the ideology of the centralized state. Mussolini actually put it very well. Everything in the state and nothing outside the state. The way the fascists looked at it, the state is kind of like an organism. It's a large living being. And every individual is like a cell of that organism. So the cell by itself has no value. The cell is only valuable insofar as it contributes to the organism. Now here's my question. Does this sound more like the Republican Party or more like the Democratic Party? This ideology of collectivism has always been on the left. Now, in fact, when we talk about, I heard Bernie Sanders the other day talking about extreme right-wingers. If there was such a thing as an extreme right-winger, because conservatism is a philosophy of limited government, the extreme of the right is a guy who doesn't want any government at all. The extreme of the right is a guy who goes around from street to street pulling up stop signs. The extreme right-winger would be something close to an anarchist. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the all-powerful government. The communists believed in that, the fascists believed in that, and the progressives believed in that. Now, there's a whole secret history between the Democratic Party and fascist Italy and Nazi Germany that has been completely swept under the rug. You will be hard-pressed to find it in any of your textbooks. In reality, Mussolini was seen as the leader of world progressivism. FDR thought so. FDR sent members of his brain trust to Rome to study fascist Italy. He wanted to bring Italian fascist ideas back to the United States. Why? Because from FDR's point of view, fascism was a more advanced, a more progressive form of progressivism. It was ahead of the New Deal. And Mussolini, for his side, loved FDR. Mussolini reviewed FDR's book called Looking Forward in an Italian magazine. Basically, I'll summarize his review this way. The book is fantastic. This guy is one of us. He's a fascist. And so, on both sides of the Atlantic, fascism was seen as on the left. Now I want to pivot to a topic that is actually a lot more controversial, and it is something that is indisputably true. Nothing in my book is arguable in the sense that I'm telling you my point of view, and then there's another point of view. What I'm about to tell you is documented, supported, accepted by mainstream historians, and yet absent from our culture, unknown even to educated people. So I want to focus very briefly on lessons that Hitler learned from the Democratic Party. And I am not kidding. So the first lesson that Hitler learned from the Democratic Party was how he should go about his conquests. I'm not saying Hitler got his appetite for conquest from the Democrats, but he didn't know how to do it. Here's Hitler sitting in Landsberg prison, and Hitler has a problem, which is that the British and the French have already conquered most of the real estate on the planet. It's the heyday of colonialism. And Hitler goes, what's left for Germany? How can we become a great power when the British and the French have already taken most of Asia, most of Africa? The British are ruling India, for example. And then Hitler goes, I have an idea. In the 19th century, the Jacksonian Democrats threw the American Indians off their land, exterminated them, did genocide on them, dispossessed them, resettled their land, and if any of them stayed back, tried to enslave them. He goes, this is a brilliant plan. I don't need to go to Asia or Africa. I will conquer right here in Europe. I will throw the Poles off their land, the Slavs, the Eastern Europeans, the Russians. I'll resettle that land with German families. If any of those people stay back, we'll make slaves of them. The point I'm trying to make is that what Hitler called Lebensraum, living space, expanding German conquest right in Europe, Hitler got that blueprint straight out of the Jacksonian Democrats of the 19th century. My source for this is one Adolf Hitler himself. Lesson number 2. A group of Nazis get together in 1935 to draft the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws were the laws that made Jews into second-class citizens. And in the Nuremberg Laws, intermarriage was prohibited between Jews and Germans, state-sponsored discrimination, later confiscation of Jewish property. These are the notorious heinous Nuremberg laws that later led to the final solution. So my question is, where did the Nazis get the blueprint for drafting the Nuremberg laws? Happily, we know the answer to this because we have the transcripts of the meetings of these Nazis. How do we have the transcripts? Because the Nazis said, we are doing something historic. We're creating the world's first racist state, a state based on racial supremacy. No one has done this before. And then one of the senior Nazis said, actually, I beg to differ. I studied in America, and I want to tell you that somebody has figured this out already. They're ahead of us. The Democrats of the American South have already done everything that we're thinking about doing. They already have laws forbidding intermarriage between blacks and whites. They already have state-sponsored segregation. They already have discrimination. They have the Ku Klux Klan. They've figured it out. They're ahead of us. All we have to do is take the word black, cross it out, write the word Jew, and we're home free. Incredibly, it is a fact of history that the Nazi Nuremberg laws are a modification with slight changes of actual laws drafted in the American South by the Democrats. I do want to emphasize, every segregation law in the United States in the South was drafted by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, and enforced by Democratic officials. This is the legacy of the Democratic Party completely. And third, one very interesting little wrinkle about this. In those debates over the Nuremberg laws, the Nazis raised an interesting question. They asked the fellow who studied in America, they said, hey, how do we define, we're having a lot of trouble deciding who is a Jew. Because after all, there's been 200 years of intermarriage between Jews and Christians. People are 50% Jewish, 25% Jewish. How do we decide who's a Jew? And the Nazi who studied in America goes, easy. In America, they have the one-drop rule. The Democrats basically say that if you have one drop of black blood, you're black. So if you are visibly black in any respect, they count you as black. And here's the sort of almost bitter irony of history. The Nazis look at this and they go, that's too much. We can't go as far as the Democrats. They're too racist for us. Basically, the Nuremberg laws required, in order for you to be classified as Jewish, that you have 3 Jewish grandparents. Later, those laws were modified to distinguish between practicing and not, but we don't need to go into that. I'm simply saying that it is an interesting footnote of history that the Nazis looked at the American definition of race, the one-drop rule, and proclaimed it too radical even for them. That's a fact. And third, the Nazis got their killing schemes, their euthanasia program, and their forced sterilization program directly from American progressives. Now, I'm not saying that they got it all from one woman, Margaret Sanger, but Margaret Sanger was part of a eugenic community. She was actually not the leader of that community. Most of the top eugenicists were big-name scientists. They regarded Margaret Sanger as a crank. She kept inviting them to come to her conventions, and they exchanged letters basically saying, this woman is nuts. But she was a eugenics wannabe. And the common theme of these eugenicists is that there are useless people in every society. And these useless people have got to be either exploited, which you can't do after slavery because you can't force them to work, but if you can't exploit them, they should be killed. And if they can't be killed, even better would be to prevent them from being born in the first place. So the eugenicists in America came up with 2 schemes that they were partial to. Most of them loved forced sterilization. That was their favorite scheme. But a minority of them favored euthanasia. I want to emphasize, when they say euthanasia, that's a euphemism, because euthanasia actually means mercy killing, somebody who's very sick and they're in terrible pain, and so that's euthanasia. The progressives weren't talking about that kind of euthanasia. They were talking about finding people who are mentally retarded, physically disabled, ill, or seen as very lower class or uneducated imbeciles in their view, and they're talking about just killing them. And one California geneticist, Paul Popenoe, said, we need lethal chambers, his term, to execute these people because there are a lot of them. You can't kill them one by one. We need to kill them in chambers in which they are basically gassed. Now, this idea reached the eugenicists in Nazi Germany. And they were like, this is great. So in 1933, the Nazis implemented forced sterilization. Hundreds of thousands of people were forcibly sterilized. And then they implemented euthanasia, gas chambers with carbon monoxide gas. This became the actual model for Hitler's final solution. The final solution, when the death camps used both carbon monoxide and Zyklon B gas, they were nothing more than an expansion of the euthanasia program. And the same personnel who had been gassing people in the euthanasia camps were transferred to now to Auschwitz and places like that to administer the final solution to the Jews. Now, all of this is so creepy, I feel a little strange even talking about it, but it's essential history because the American progressives who had contributed to this Nazi program, how did they react to the idea that the Nazis were implementing their schemes? Answer, they knew about it and they loved it. They congratulated each other on their influence in shaping the German program. Margaret Sanger was going around in the 30s giving speeches about how the Germans are getting ahead of us. They're actually they're more progressive than we are. We need to copy them. An American eugenicist named Madison Grant got a letter from Hitler. He was super excited. So he goes to a fellow progressive and he goes, check this out, my letter from Hitler. And that guy goes, wait right here, goes into his library, comes back out, produces his letter from Hitler. So these are guys this would be like people exchanging congratulations among themselves. Okay, this is the actual historical legacy of what we call progressivism. When people call themselves progressives, this is their history. But after the war, after World War II, all of this became completely taboo. And the progressives who knew about it, they knew that fascism is the ideology of the centralized state. They knew that they had been in bed with Mussolini's fascism and to a lesser degree even with Hitler's Nazis. After the war, they go, you know what? We have got to prevent people, especially young people, from learning any of this. Because if they do, the Democratic Party is finished. The progressive movement is done. We will be so discredited that nobody will identify with us ever again. And then began a great cover-up scheme. And by cover-up scheme, the way you cover things up in academia is you just don't mention them. So in the media, we talk about fake news. I'm talking about fake scholarship. I'm talking about a cover-up scheme that basically says, let's essentially leave out of the record all the progressive complicity in fascism or Nazism, and let's try to move fascism from the left-wing column, where it's always belonged, let's shift it into the right-wing column, So now I want to fast forward to now. And I want to ask, because some people are going to say, well, Dinesh, this is actually a very creepy and disturbing history, but the Democrats now are not the Democrats of the 30s. True, they lionize FDR, they lionize Woodrow Wilson, they lionize JFK, JFK went to Nazi Germany in the 30s, had extremely nice things to say about Hitler, had pretty nice things to say about Hitler in 1945 after the war. This is JFK, not his dad. Again, you'd be hard-pressed to find all this in a textbook, even though, as I say, what I'm telling you is the undisputed facts of history. But still, we have to ask, where is this fascism now? Where is this fascism in the Democratic Party now? And I want to identify 3 places where it still exists, and then conclude by telling you what we can do about it. So the first place is fascism. We can see it, and the most obvious place, and maybe the least dangerous place, is in the Antifa movement. All the anti-fascists who look and sound and behave like fascists, yes, they actually are acting in a fascist way. That's true. And they're doing it in the name of fighting fascism. Their guru, by the way, is a guy named Herbert Marcuse, a philosopher who taught at Berkeley. He was a refugee from Nazism, but he was also a Marxist. And when he came to America, what he basically said is, we the left, we're the tolerant people. We're the tolerant people, I know. He goes, but we don't have to be tolerant of the intolerant. And so if we can define our enemies as intolerant, then we are justified in using any kind of force or intimidation or any kind of tactics by any means necessary. We can shut them down. Marcuse called this repressive tolerance. He wrote an essay of that title, Repressive Tolerance, arguing that intolerance is justified when applied against intolerant people. So this is, you may say, fascism part one. A second form of fascism today, much deeper and more powerful. The Nazis had a term called Gleichschaltung. Gleichschaltung basically means coordination. And what the Nazis meant is we need a society where everybody in the society marches to the same tune, in lockstep. No marching out of tune. All the cultural institutions of the society must be playing the same music. And in America, we have a term for Gleichschaltung. It's called political correctness. And this isn't just a matter of getting the words right. It's the matter that if you are in these institutions, academia, the media, Hollywood, and you get sufficiently out of line, you will be severely punished. You will be driven out of your profession. You'll be discredited. You will be blackballed. Look at this group in Hollywood, Friends of Abe, 2,000 people. Writers, screenwriters, and they have meetings, but they never announce their meetings. And their membership list is secret. And some people show up to meetings in disguise. Now, why would you have to do that unless you thought that if your name were known, you'd never work in that town again? So this is Gleichschaltung American style. And is it being imposed by the right? No, it's being imposed by the left. By the left. Now I want to say a word about fascist economics, because I want to show that the economic policy of the Democratic Party, of Obama, but also of Bernie, of Elizabeth Warren, is fascist in the classic meaning of the term, in the dictionary meaning of the term. If you look up fascism, the economic part of it, it basically says state-run capitalism, state-directed capitalism. That's the meaning of fascism. Now, here's the interesting thing. We often accuse the left of being socialist, but in reality, these guys aren't socialists. Because what do socialist countries do? Socialist countries nationalize industries. The government takes over the energy industry. The government takes over the banks. Now, notice under Obamacare, we still have private insurance companies. We still have private hospitals, but the government is directing them. The government's fixing the price. The government's telling them what to do. Under Obama, we saw an expansion of government direction and control over not just the health sector, but banks, insurance companies, energy companies, increasingly the education sector. That's why Bernie and Hillary wanted free college. Their idea was the government now gets to direct even private colleges in telling them what to do. So my point is, this is not socialism. If it was socialism, the government would have taken over all this stuff. This is actually fascism. State-directed capitalism. That's what fascism means. And in that respect, fascism is with us now. So let's think about this for a minute. We've always thought of fascism as some European thing from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, but we're actually seeing a reincarnation of fascism. Fascism is actually the left's preferred mode of socialism. And that's going on in our lives now. So what do we do about this? What do we do about it on campus? And what do we do about it in the country? I think on campus, the critical thing here is that we've got to realize that we're dealing with people who don't respect the norms of civility. When I came to America in the Reagan era, American politics was a gentleman's fight. And you could see Tip O'Neill and Reagan having it out and then going for a beer afterward. I think you know that is not the America we live in now. And so what I'm saying to you is that if we're going to be anti-fascists, we've got to realize that we're up against a very formidable and ruthless adversary. And we've got to be tough in the mode that we maybe didn't want to be before, in order to make our voice heard and in order to stand up for things that are now insecure, even though they have never been insecure in American life before. Look at these Republicans on the Hill. We call them rhinos. We say they're weak. They are weak. Why are they weak? They're weak because they're scared of the media. They know that the media has the power to humiliate. They know that the media has the power to blacken and ruin them so badly that when the media is finished, their own side will bury them. They know that. That's why they behave the way that they do. And they also don't realize that the era of gentleman's politics is over. The guy who does realize this is Trump. Trump recognizes the new situation. The new situation created Trump. And Trump, to his credit, knows that we are fighting not just a political fight, but a cultural fight. And so I love the way that this guy Trump, I mean, he's pulling us out of the trade treaty, and he's fighting over Obamacare, and he got Gorsuch on the Supreme Court, but at the same time, he finds time to swat Meryl Streep over here and whack Saturday Night Live over there and take on CNN. Wow. You know, even Reagan focused on a few priorities. Reagan's view was like, you can't change the world in 40 ways. You can change it in 2, maybe 3 ways. I'm going to focus on this, this, and this, and I'm going to let the rest of it be. Trump, I mean, for a guy who's, 71, is just the most energetic guy on all fronts. And he's fighting mutinies in his own party, and the conservative intelligentsia has deserted him. One reason I feel alienated from a lot of my fellow conservatives that I came up with is that those guys are living emotionally and intellectually in a different world. They don't realize that the world has changed. But I think you realize it. It's changed not just technologically, but politically. And I think the good news is that we have a chance to win this. I wouldn't be over-optimistic. Why? Yeah, we won the election. Yeah, we might even have all 3 branches of government, but even that victory is temporary. There's another election. We could be undone. The left owns academia. They own the media, and they own Hollywood. And it's really hard to take those institutions back. So they have permanent forces at their command. We have temporary victories that we must consolidate. That's why it's great to see Trump in West Virginia. He's consolidating his political majority. That's what he needs to do. I'm really glad to see Trump on Twitter. Everyone's like, take away his Twitter. I'm like, what, and give it to you? You wouldn't know what to do with it. You know, staffer number 3. So we're in a new fight. Ultimately, I think you can say it's by tragic necessity. It is our destiny to be alive now and this moment. And rather than bemoan it, and rather than curse it, I think we should embrace it, we should live up to it, we should vindicate the American dream, and then we'll be able to achieve the goal that Reagan spoke so wistfully about, the dream that he called Morning in America. Thank you very much. Thank you. Guys, thank you very much. I'll be excited. I'll be happy to sign books afterward if any of you want to get copies. But we have some time for questions, and so let's go for it, and I will be as quick as I can so we can get as many in as possible.
Dinesh D'Souza, I really, really thank you for coming here today. You are one of my political idols. I really appreciate you. And What I really appreciate too is how you properly framed communism, fascism, and many other isms, which leads me to my question regarding debate tactics. I learned a lot from debating, from watching you versus Cenk Uygur last year at Politicon. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. What I learned was you said to Cenk, it's very important to make sure that you frame your opponents correctly. And I think about that a lot. I want to know, when you go into a debate, how do you prepare and ensure that you are going to frame your opponents correctly, sir?
I think in a debate, I would give two pieces of advice. The first is, many people who go into a debate are so driven by so much adrenaline that you don't actually hear what the other person is saying. And so you don't meet their argument because you don't even hear it. Even when they start speaking, you're formulating your response. And so you're unable to take on the force of their argument. So try in a debate to stay calm and listen to what the other person is saying. When the other person is making a point, and sometimes they'll make 5 points, don't feel like you have to answer all 5. It's very important to take one of those 5 points, but then completely crush it. So instead of flailing around 5 and racing for the clock, you pick the one, and it's best to pick the one that carries the most weight. So if the other person has spoken and they got applause in 1 point out of 5, crush that one. That's the one to crush. And so I think those two just simple tips, I think, are helpful in thinking about. And then present your own ideas succinctly. Make the argument, sum it up, and get out.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Connor McCormack. I'm from Hopkinsville Community College in Kentucky. I'd just like to say you have changed my life with what you've done. So my question is, feminism originally started as a pretty righteous group and a pretty righteous cause, but then it devolved into, well, what it is now. Do you think something like that could happen to conservatism?
That's a question that's a very penetrating question. And let's think about how the feminist movement made so much headway in such a short time. And the answer is, feminism traveled on the back of the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement kind of established that race is a relatively inconsequential, in a sense, irrelevant characteristic. One group called it the painted face. And so the feminists came along and basically said, well, that's kind of true of gender too, at least in important respects. If I'm working in a job and I can do the job, why should it matter whether I'm male or female? So in American politics, you travel the furthest if you build on an accepted principle and you can run with it. Now, in my own recent work, I've tried to learn from this, because in the past, if you notice, when people, one thing the left does is it takes the crimes that they did and they blame them on America. The horrible American history of slavery. Well, America didn't do these things. You did. Some Americans did them and other Americans stopped them. So the traditional conservative tactic, historically, since I've been a conservative, was to apologize for America. Slavery wasn't all that bad. Many other cultures had slavery too. What's uniquely American, and I've made these arguments myself in the America film, but they're actually not the strongest arguments. Why? Because you're up against the wall. You're explaining, you're on the defensive, you're making the we're not so bad people case. As opposed to what I've done in my recent film, Hillary's America, which is to completely embrace the critique and shove it, I should say, down their throats. In other words, not to make any defense of America, but essentially to say all these evil things that you're accusing us of, not only are you guilty of them, but you've never admitted them, you've never apologized for them, you've never done restitution. Now, not only rhetorically, but for anyone who's making a movie, that's a better movie, because the movie is on the attack. And so politically, you want to be on the attack all the time and look for rhetorical strategies that enable you to do that. So the way for conservatism to succeed is to grab the moral high ground and attack.
Thank you. I love you, Dinesh.
Hi there, I'm Saurabh Sharma from the University of Texas at Austin, and I wanted to thank you so much. You've long provided a role model for, an Indian American conservative in a community that isn't too tolerant of very political openness. My question to you is, politics is downstream from culture. That's something Andrew Breitbart used to say, and it's been argued that culture is downstream from academia. You're making your case for the true history of this country in the culture. Is it possible that that can go backwards and penetrate the academic institutions that have done the revisionist history?
Yes. The ideal way, there are two ways to change an argument. One is to change it from within academia. And that would be easy to do if we had adequate representation in academia to do that. So I would then begin a lifelong career of writing articles in scholarly magazines, disputing different points and laying out new frameworks and new ways of thinking. Unable to do that, when I was young, I thought to myself, I'd love to be a professor at Princeton, do what some of these public intellectuals do, teach political science, and then have a public life as well. But I realized if I do all that work to get my PhD, they're probably going to freeze me out. It's going to be extreme because politics dominates that selection. So now I rely on a little different strategy. And that is I go out in the culture and I make startling factual claims that have a scientific character to them. By that I mean they're refutable in the scientific sense. It's not my opinion versus your opinion. In the Hillary's America movie, this was my classic claim of that nature. In the year 1860, the year before the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. Because typically when you start this debate, people go, well, as you know, Dinesh, we don't want to hear about 200 years ago. There's a lot of blame to go around. And so I was taking on the there's a lot of blame to go around, and I said, wait a minute, no Republican owned a slave. All the slaves in the country, 4 million of them, were owned by Democrats. Now the beauty of this kind of statement is it is easily refutable. If you can produce a list of 5 Republicans who own slaves, I would have to take it back. But no one can. And so after massive research and thrashing around, one guy writes me, he goes, I'm a scholar of history. He goes, I found a single counter example. Ulysses S. Grant inherited a slave on his wife's side. And I go, that would normally be a big touche, except at the time that Ulysses S. Grant inherited that slave, he was a Democrat. He only became a Republican later. So, when a claim like this is put out into the culture, and the progressive scholars have every opportunity to refute it, like I've said things here today that in academic climates would be considered extremely explosive. The idea that there's not a mere analogy between Hitler and the Democrats, he got his schemes from them. So I've put out refutable material. If I'm wrong, show me. If Rachel Maddow can prove I'm wrong, put me on the air and let's see. But she can't, and she won't, most likely. So this is a way to shake things up from the outside, but it's bound to percolate onto the inside because you can't let a stance like that go unquestioned without it causing a reorientation. Even right now, the race card has lost some of its sting. You go on social media and post memes of David Duke, you'll see 300 memes of Robert Byrd in a Ku Klux Klan outfit. So we have given our side plenty of ammunition to push back on the race card. And I want to do the same with the fascism card.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, last question.
Good afternoon, Dinesh.
Hello.
My name's Ryan. I'm from the United Kingdom. And when immigrants like yourself come to America, you see open patriotism from most Americans, so there's flags everywhere and stuff like that. What can Europe learn from the American experience of integrating immigrant communities?
That's a that's a tough question, and its complexity puts in my mind the idea that maybe I should have cut off the questions before you stood up. But quite honestly, I think that the difficulty in Europe is this, and that part of it is that Europe is a civilization based on history, whereas America is a society based on ideas. A society based on ideas is much more porous. It has a much greater solvent power of assimilation because you assimilate to the ideas and the way of life. Another way to put it is that America can very easily be a multiracial society. though not a multicultural society. We have people of different races, but they speak the same language, they live by the same dreams, they play by the same rules, they embrace the same constitution, and so on. Part of the problem in Europe is that if you come from the outside, it's difficult to be digested. So can a Turk become a German? Can an Indian become an Englishman? Can an Algerian become a Frenchman? I don't know, but I do know that the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, and today the West Indians and the Pakistanis, they come to America and they become Americans. If you look at the Palestinians and the Jews in Silicon Valley, they get along famously. They're all working on high tech. They're sharing the same dreams. So bottom line, I think America has an easier time with this than Europe. Now, the other problem, of course, is that Europe, the most secular society in the world, is also trying to absorb the most religiously fanatical society in the world. You have literally, in the case of radical Muslims and radical secularists, you have just a potent formula for problems. And so Europe is taking the immigrants that it can least afford to take. The Muslims will fare better in America in general for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. So look, I want to end by saying this, though, that a lot of times people act as if this issue, that a society is illiberal or fascist if it says no to immigrants. Trump hasn't said no to immigrants, by the way. Trump has said no to illegals. Illegals are not immigrants. Illegals are not immigrants. The rights of the US Constitution do not apply to aliens. The Constitution is a social compact among citizens. And that's not fascism. I mean, that's classical liberalism. Classical liberalism. Even our immigration policy, and I close on this, our immigration policy is a total mess. Debbie, my wife who's here, is an immigrant from Venezuela. I'm an immigrant from India. I came to this country in 1978 at the age of 17. If I had done work, my whole family is over there, but if I wanted, over the past 35 years or 30 years, I could probably have brought around between 70 and 100 of my relatives to America under the family unification rule of our immigration policy. It works kind of like this. I sponsor my parents. My parents then sponsor my brother and sister. They sponsor their wives. Their wives then sponsor their parents. And so it goes. Now, this is not what this was meant to be at all. This was basically meant to reunify a husband with his wife and recreate the nuclear family in America. So the policy has been scandalously abused. And even our legal policies need to be fixed. So Trump is on it. He's getting a lot of pushback because, again, of this sort of fuzzy thinking that says that if we like the Statue of Liberty, that means we shouldn't be reforming our immigration policy. It's total nonsense. It's total nonsense. And I think the immigrants should be the ones to be the least to stand up for it. We're in a new era. It's our era. I'm looking out at you guys and the courage that you have now in fighting these battles. It's very exemplary. The problem today on campus is much worse than it was a generation ago when I was a student. So many of you, you say that you admire me. I want you to know I admire you, and I just want to say to keep up the fight. At the end of it, I think you'll win. Thank you very much.